Um, I've been asked to do a workshop on teaching the memoir and personal essay. I know many of you, in responding to the questions on your course application, we're talking more broadly about teaching rhetoric and nonfiction, and so this is a branch of rhetoric and nonfiction, but we're going to be talking about teaching memoir and the personal essay. And so I've interpreted this charge broadly, and so I'm going to be coming at this task from two different directions. So, and hope both of them will be of value to all of you. I'm going to first talk about teaching students how to read and analyze personal writing. And so to that end, I've provided you with a couple of sample personal essays, sort of classic American personal essays that we'll be discussing in more detail. And don't worry, if you didn't have the chance to read them, you won't be tested on them. But it would help if you've read them, but it's not necessary. So we're going to be looking at those in a little bit more detail as a kind of model for how you can teach analyzing the personal essay to your students. And then I'll be referring to several other essays that I have also made available on the Humanities Texas Google Classroom site that you can download and use in your own classrooms and look at later. So the goal in this first part is going to give you tools for teaching students to analyze this kind of writing so as to achieve the relevant TEKS outcomes. Then in the second half of the presentation, I'll shift to talking about teaching students how to actually produce this kind of writing, how to produce personal essay writing. As you all know, this can be kind of a fraught endeavor because it's basically the only thing students want to write about is, themselves. And so it's a great way just to get them to write, right? Just to get them to start writing. But it can be very, very difficult to assess this kind of writing and to make it serve the desired learning outcomes and to impose even some structure on it, because your students then can somehow feel like you're judging them as people and judging their experiences. So that's not what we're trying to do, of course. So I'm going to try to offer what I've found to be a couple of really useful frameworks for teaching students how to write in this genre. I've read over the responses, as I said, that you provided to Humanities Texas about your challenges and hopes for this workshop. And I'm grateful to all of you for giving me a sense of where you are and what you're hoping to get out of this. But let's get started with a few questions specific to this workshop so I can maybe get a sense of where you are related to this topic. So I am going to, now how do there we go. I am going to the personal agenda, introduction, sorry. 4 questions. So what I would like you to do in the chat is to I've got 4 questions here, just answer 1 or 2 of them, and then let's use that as a kind of jumping off point. So one of the questions that I'm interested in would be, what do you like best about teaching personal writing, personal essays? If you do this kind of teaching, what essays or memoirs do you use in the classroom? What do your students like best about reading and analyzing personal writing? Or what do your students like best about writing personal essays? So if you could just take, I don't know, 2 minutes and in the chat, just respond to 1 or 2 of these, and then let's use them as a kind of jumping off point. So let's take about 2 minutes of that, and I'll look in the chat here. All right, so you can keep responding, but some of these responses are really interesting. So a number of you, and I'll just point to Maria Joyer. What I like best about personal writing is the opportunity to get to know my students and their style of writing, and a number of you had responded to that way. Maria, if you don't mind me calling on you, what do you like best about getting to know your students, and how does that help you achieve your objectives in the classroom? Or anyone else who responded this way, you can unmute yourself and speak up.
I like that I get to learn about their personal experiences, so their likes, dislikes, maybe their strengths and weaknesses, and I get to know them as a student that way. We always have a Free Write Friday, and they can write about anything, and they always choose to write about their experiences, and that's just an opportunity for me to get to learn them, what they like, and also their writing style, their mechanics as well.
Great. Yeah. Yes, I completely agree. And even, I teach college students and I teach graduate students, and it's the same thing. I find that being able to learn something about them and how they approach writing and how they approach what they're willing to put down on the paper, or on the screen, is really helpful in helping me figure out how to reach them and how to help achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve. Nina, I think that you had said it makes you uneasy, or it makes your students uneasy. In what way?
I suppose, well, ever since after with COVID happening, I've had students that they don't know if it's, do they get more personal, or they get really personal right away and then they don't want to write beyond that. It's very weird. I can't explain it more than that. It's just, I guess for the most part, I teach at night as well. I teach just 1301 and 1302. And I find that these personal essays, at least for 1301, they feel more comfortable writing about themselves when we're like mid through, like, midterm, that's their midterm paper, and they feel more comfortable at that point, and not so much in the beginning. So I kind of time it and present it a little different as a result of that, and just reading the classroom as well.
Yeah, I would suspect that many of you are dealing with a very different kind of population. It's not a different population, but students who they feel very different to me after COVID. And I'm dealing with, the students I deal with are older. The students most of you are dealing with were probably smaller children when COVID was happening. Mine that I'm dealing with right now were in the middle of high school, but they're very, very different than they were before COVID. And I'm still learning about how to reach them. Well, thank you. Well, these are really useful. These are really useful. And I thank everybody for your comments, and for opening up about that, because it's helpful to me. So I guess that I am going to start by saying that while now I actually really prefer teaching, and many of you had said in your challenges and hopes that that you much prefer teaching fiction and drama and even poetry to nonfiction. And I'll say that although now I really do prefer teaching nonfiction, that was not always the case. I much preferred fiction, drama, even poetry. But what I've found to be so compelling about the broad category of nonfiction in teaching college students, but again, I often teach freshmen all the time, so they're really just 1 year out of high school. But what I really like about it is how personal essays and what we might call creative nonfiction balances two things, sort of balances telling the truth and then also using craft to frame your story or argument. And the two are often in great tension, right? You want to tell the truth, you're obliged to tell the truth. It's nonfiction. But at the same time, you want to use craft, you want to use the techniques, often the techniques of fiction, in order to make the story compelling or to make the argument more compelling. And in fact, some of the best essay writers were also really fantastic story writers. And the two we'll be talking about in more detail today, James Baldwin and Joan Didion, were both very, very accomplished novelists and short story writers, in addition to being some of the best essayists in the history of American literature. So rather than thinking about nonfiction as a kind of non-creative endeavor, I always think about it as a type of heightened creativity. That the writer wants to tell a story in the way that they could in the best fiction, but are tethered to the truth at the same time. So how do they strike a balance? So I've made available, as I said earlier, on the Humanities Texas Google Classroom site, two of the most classic personal essays in 20th century American literature. James Baldwin's Notes from a Native Son, which was written in about 1954, and Joan Didion, Goodbye to All That, from 1967. And I hope that many of you had a chance to look at these, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have read them in the past. These are just all-time classic essays. And so what I would like to do in the first part of my presentation is talk about them, not primarily in terms of what they're saying, because I think that they're not difficult for us to understand, or even for students to understand, the sort of the kind of argument or gist of these is pretty clear to any reader, any competent reader. But what I want to talk about is how the writer uses craft and technique to get across what they're trying to do. And I think that this is how I teach creative nonfiction. This is how I teach the personal essay, is looking at it as a work of craft, and then getting to, at the end, getting to how do all these add up to what the writer is trying to accomplish. So the key elements of personal writing, as with the key elements of any fiction, are first the narrator, or who's talking in the essay, the character who we're reading about, or the characters. Sometimes it is the author themselves, sometimes it is about somebody else. The plot, of course, or the sequence of events, things that happen in the personal essay. Most essays have some sort of plot. They don't all have to have some sort of plot. The voice, which we'll talk about a lot today, or the language and style used by the narrator. And then the context, the historical, geographical, cultural, or any other kinds of factors that link this personal story to events outside of itself. And this is a really, really important element of creative nonfiction that is often not, well, I'm not going to say it's not present in fiction, but it's so much more essential for the success of creative nonfiction or personal writing than it is for fiction. So let's just look at narrator first. And I'm just, again, I know that not all of you have had the chance to look at Baldwin and Didion, and so I'm just pulled out a couple excerpts, and let's just talk about narrator and how you might present narrator to students. So here, this is the opening paragraph to James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son. And I'm just going to read it. On the 29th of July in 1943, my father died. On the same day, a few hours later, his last child was born. Over a month before this, while all our energies were concentrated in waiting for these events, there had been in Detroit one of the bloodiest race riots of the century. A few hours after my father's funeral, while he lay in state in the Undertaker's chapel, a race riot broke out in Harlem. On the morning of the 3rd of August, we drove my father to the graveyard through a wilderness of smashed plate glass. So what do we notice here about the narrator? What do we learn about them? Nothing much, really, apart from the fact that they had a father, that they appear to have known the father so as to drive the father to the funeral. So if it's a personal essay, if we're not talking about the author, we're not talking about the person, what are we talking about? What comes out in this opening paragraph? What does the narrator try to focus our attention on? Does anyone want to pull out that? Anyone want to shout out an answer to that? Like, what are we supposed to be focusing on? The concern with time and the concern with the sequence of events. The author here, Baldwin, wants the reader to be thinking about time and the sequence of events. The sentence structure here is repetitive. We have 5 sentences, each one beginning with a prepositional phrase referring to time and events in time that point to him. On the 29th of July, over a month before this, on the same day, a few hours after, on the morning. So in teaching this to students, you could just start with this paragraph and say, how does this set the stage? What are you expecting from this? What do you think this essay is going to be about? What relationship does this writer want you to have to the events that he is narrating? So where is the narrator? Sorry. Where is the narrator? In the second paragraph, then, the narrator shows up. The day of my father's funeral had also been my 19th birthday. As we drove him to the graveyard, the spoils of injustice, anarchy, discontent, and hatred were all around us. It seemed to me that God himself had devised, to mark my father's end, the most sustained and brutally dissonant of codas, etc. When his life had ended, I began to wonder about that life and also, in a new way, to be apprehensive about my own. So In the second paragraph, we finally show the narrator. Notice that we are linking in this second paragraph through its first line to the previous paragraph through a statement of time, the day of my father's funeral. It's not a prepositional phrase the way the others were. It's simply a noun phrase, the day of my father's funeral. But it links this to the previous one while shifting our attention now to the authors. The sentences in the paragraph aggressively move us into the narrator's head. It seemed to me, I had declined to believe. I had been inclined to be contemptuous. I began to wonder. So simply by looking at these two paragraphs, you can talk with students about how sentence and paragraph level craft teach the reader how to understand what the writer is doing and set the stage for what the writer wants the reader to be thinking about these events. So then let's look at Didion's very different essay. It's easy to see the beginnings of things and harder to see the ends. I can remember now the clarity that makes the nerves in the back of my neck constrict when New York began for me. But I cannot lay my finger upon the moment it ended, can never cut through the ambiguities and second starts and broken resolves to the exact place on the page where the heroine is no longer as optimistic as she once was. When I first saw New York, I was 20 and it was summertime, and I got off a DC-7 at the old Idlewild temporary terminal in a new dress, which had seemed very smart in Sacramento, but seemed less smart already, even in the old Idlewild temporary terminal. And the warm air smelled of mildew and some instinct programmed by all the movies I had ever seen and the songs I had ever heard sung and the stories I had ever read about New York informed me that it would never be quite the same again. In fact, it never was. Sometime later, there was a song on all the jukeboxes on the Upper East Side that went, "But where is the schoolgirl who used to be me?" And if it was late enough at night, I used to wonder that. I know now that almost everyone wonders something like that sooner or later, and no matter what he or she is doing. But one of the mixed blessings of being 20 and 21 and even 23 is the conviction that nothing like this, all evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, has ever happened to anyone before. So then we ask, in a similar way as we did to the Baldwin, so who is this narrator? Does anyone want to, who is this person? What do we know about this person's attitude? Does anyone want to speak up on that? What are the narrator's concerns and interests? How are they different than in Baldwin? Where Baldwin was focused on time, was focused on his father's funeral, was focused on how this event, my father's funeral, seemed to come in the middle of other broader events. It seemed to then tell me something about how I fit in the world. Didion is completely in her own head. Didion is looking back at a time when she thought she was the center of the universe. Everything is I. And then how does the sentence structure convey these concerns and interests? So whereas you have this very tight sentence structure in Baldwin, a bunch of repeated time-focused prepositional phrases, here we have what we would call a paratactic sentence. And that's a word that just means a bunch of clauses related to each other simply by and. When I first saw New York, I was 20, and it was summertime, and I did this, and the warm air smelled, and all the songs, and this happened. A bunch of, not unrelated, but these are flashes of memory. These are flashes of sensory experience. So just in these two first paragraphs, we see how these writers are distinguishing themselves in what they're concerned about and what they're thinking about. Okay, so that's narrator, character. So in both of these essays, the narrator, the author, is talking about the people that they used to be. These essays are about change. So both of them are talking about the people who they used to be. In Baldwin, if you've read along, you'll see that he uses that to then talk about how I was consumed by rage in my life, the way that my father was. Now, what am I? Didion in her essay is, I was overwhelmed by the experience of New York, and now what am I? So then plot brings us to the present. If the structure that we are being set up in both of these is, I used to be this way, the narration sets us up for the structure of, I used to be this way, and now I'm this way. The narrator tells us that's what we're going to be focusing on, and then the plot is what gets us there. So then if you've read the essay, you remember that in Baldwin, the plot is, I hated my father's rage, and I hated him because of it. When I entered the world, I began to understand and then develop at that rage. I saw what it could make me do and what it would make others do. Because of this, I came to realize that one cannot allow the rage to take over. I was this way, I had these experiences, and I ended up this way. Didion's essay is structured the same way. Coming to New York was like coming to a magic place where everything was possible and one could live without consequences and nothing was irrevocable. I then realized that one can live in this netherworld too long that when one becomes an adult, what once seemed magical, now comes to seem oppressive. So plot brings us there. So this is really important to signal to your students that plot and character have to be linked. Young writers tend to want to do one or the other. They talk about themselves and their feelings, or they narrate events. But in a personal essay, the two have to be linked. And these two personal essays are extraordinary in the way that they show how the two are linked, plot and character. They must reinforce each other. They must fuel each other. We learn about the character through what happens in the plot, and the plot is interesting to us because we know something about the character. So these are obviously two highly accomplished essays. Your students won't be able to write like this, but as they are writing their personal essays, have them focus on that. Make sure that plot and character are in this symbiotic relationship with each other. And you can have your students, as they're planning it, talk about that. So this leads us to the next crucial element of a good personal essay, which is context. So we all have rich inner lives, and we are all the center of our own universes. But unless you're a parent, nobody really wants to enter into anyone else's inner life unless there's something compelling, something that we want to latch onto. And so in a personal essay, that something is context. So these things that I think and I feel and I experience that I am talking about happened in a context that is interesting to other people. So I have here on this slide, in many personal essays, plot boils down to, here is how a series of events caused me to change my mind or feelings about this thing that is important to me. So this is probably the most common type of personal essay, but this type of plot has to be interesting for at least one of two reasons. Either the personal change or development is one that many people share and can relate to, and it's a kind of different or unique take on that, or the personal development or change takes place in a context that people are interested in. So for Baldwin, that was the dawn of the civil rights movement and the experience of being subjected to racism. For Didion, it was the experience of being young and leaving the provinces and moving to New York. But what we need, what makes a good personal essay, is taking plot and linking it to context, linking it to something that makes it interesting to someone outside of ourselves. So for Baldwin, here's the context. Him in a restaurant in Princeton, New Jersey, being subjected to racism. All right. The context for Baldwin's essay, the civil rights movement, the psychological effects of racism, the roots of violence in deprivation, and coming to terms with a parent. So here's why his story resonates. Here's why his story speaks to more than just his personal experience. For Didion, the context here is the experience of being young and free, the experience of being provincial, a small town kid who moves to the city and becomes sophisticated. That was me. New York City as an abstraction become a reality. So many people have had that experience, and so many people dream of that experience. And Didion writes that experience in a way that we want to learn more about. We want to learn more about her take on it. Okay. So these are just ideas about the context for these two essays. You may find other things interesting about them. Everybody's going to find one of the reasons that these essays resonate so much is that we always continue to find things that are interesting about them. But in terms of teaching context, I have included on the Google Classroom a Megan Daum essay called "Music is My Bag" about being part of like this really nerdy music subculture when she was in high school. We all have had the experience of being part of like a low status group in school, right? But in this context, there is a particular kind of music nerddom that you've probably sort of seen and marveled at, and that's what makes her essay interesting. Gloria Ansaldúa, for bilinguals who code switch, they will find this very interesting. For those who don't, it's about the ability to, it's fascinating to think of code switching and how one of your languages that you use is devalued and even ostracized. So those are the kind of contexts that make those essays interesting if you're talking about teaching context. So I want to continue here by talking a little bit about the voice and the rhythm, and we'll just conclude with this. So if you look at this, and this is something else that you can talk about when you're looking at these essays with your students, ask them again, as we did with the introductory paragraphs, ask them, how does the writer set up a rhythm of the sentence? And so I'm just going to read part of this from Baldwin, who is one of the great prose stylists, as is Dickens in American literary history. So the real man, whoever he had been, had suffered, and now he was dead. This was all that was sure and all that mattered now. Every man in the chapel hoped that when his hour came, he too would be eulogized, which is to say forgiven, and that all of his lapses, greeds, errors, and strayings from the truth would be invested with coherence and looked upon with charity. This was perhaps the last thing human beings could give each other, and it was what they demanded after all of the Lord. Only the Lord saw the midnight tears. Only the Lord saw the midnight tears. Only he was present when one of his children, moaning and wringing hands, paced up and down the room. When one slapped one's child in anger, the recoil in the heart reverberated through heaven and became part of the pain of the universe. And when the children were hungry and sullen and distrustful, and one watched them daily growing wilder and further away and running headlong into danger, it was the Lord who knew what the charged heart endured as the strap was laid to the backside. The Lord alone who knew what one would have said if one had, like the Lord, the gift of the living word. It was the Lord who knew of the impossibility every parent in that room faced, how to prepare the child for the day when the child would be despised, and how to create in the child, by what means, a stronger antidote to this poison than one had found for oneself. So you can show your students in this passage the kind of rising and accelerating rhythm of a sentence that brings us into the sort of intensity of feeling. Shorter sentences, pieces of sentences. The real man, whoever he had been, suffered and now he was dead. This was all that was sure and all that mattered now. It accelerates. It builds on itself. Baldwin was a 14-year-old street preacher. You could talk about that. And that sort of rhythm comes out here. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. Then we can also talk about, the last thing I'll talk about in terms of these essays is called meta-language. So where Baldwin wants us to be immersed in the actual feelings and facts of what is happening, Didion is intellectualizing everything and making us think about how do we talk about things. In retrospect, it seems to me that those days before I knew the names of all the bridges were happier than the ones that came later, but perhaps you will see that as we go along. Part of what I want to tell you is what it is like to be young in New York. How 6 months can become 8 years with the deceptive ease of a film dissolve, for that is how those years appear to me now, in a long sequence of sentimental dissolves and old-fashioned trick shots. The Seagram building fountains dissolve into snowflakes. I enter a revolving door at 20 and come out a good deal older and on a different street. But most particularly, I want to explain to you, and in the process, perhaps to myself, why I no longer live in New York. Meta-language is a term for language that talks about language. So in here, it would be the writer saying, like, what I want to tell you, what's important about what I'm saying is, most particularly, I want to explain to you that, as opposed to Baldwin, which draws us in, which makes us want to be in the middle of the events narrated, this separates us out. This reminds us, I'm not living these experiences. I'm hearing someone process them intellectually. These are two kinds of opposite ways of handling experience and trying to make sense of experience. So talking about what you're saying takes the reader out of the moment, makes the reader realize that they are reading something constructed. And meta language makes us think of the writer as a writer building this essay. And of course, this is fitting because this essay is about Joan Didion becoming a professional writer. So a number of you had talked, I would like to transition now to sort of think about having students write. A number of you in your challenges and hopes talked about how difficult it is to get students to read essays like this because they're so immersed in social media as a primary means of communication and of the revelation of the self. And that's absolutely true. And I think we all not only experience it, but many of us engage in it. And so one way of approaching personal essays in thinking about and explaining them to students why people do it, you might ask your students after they've read one of these, how is a personal essay like a social media post? Because in many ways, they serve the same purpose. So how are they similar? They're similar because in one sense, a personal essay provides information about the author that they want you to know about them, right? Personal essay does that, social media post does that, whether it's like an Instagram story or a TikTok video about yourself, or if you're really old, a Facebook page about yourself. A social media post kind of curates a self, to use a word that I have come to really loathe, but it curates a self for the author. The personal essay is a way of like taking, here's who I am and here's what I want you to think about me, and presenting it very much like social media feeds. They curate a self for us. It also suggests a way for the reader to understand the events presented. Finally, a good social media post, like a good personal essay, shows a real mastery of the genre, whether it is really skilled selfie techniques. I was on a study abroad trip with some students recently, and they showed me how to take a 0.5 selfie, which is where you don't use the selfie camera, but you flip it around to use the regular camera, put on 0.5, and it makes you look very odd. But you use it to accomplish certain things that you want to accomplish with your followers. We all know that like a good TikTok video is amazing, is really fantastic. So a personal essay like Didion's, like Baldwin's, shows a real mastery of the genre, but also a good social media feed shows a real mastery of the genre. And you can tell your students it's the same kind of thing. It's understanding a genre, understanding conventions, understanding how it works, and using it to its greatest effect. At the same time, a good personal essay is not like a social media post, in that a good personal essay should be unintentionally revealing. I think not curated in that way. A good personal essay will reveal things about ourselves that maybe we would rather keep hidden, or that maybe we would rather not confront. And rarely does a social media post do that. A good personal essay also opens up ambiguity. It doesn't teach us one way of interpreting the message, one way of interpreting the event, one way of interpreting ourselves, but rather the ambiguity of there's different ways of understanding what this means. And a good personal essay will also struggle with the conventions of the genre. We'll push against them. We'll say like, this is not the way I want to be communicating, but I really want to be communicating. And so I don't know how to do this. And we see this with all of the essays that I have posted, that they struggle with the conventions of the genre. And finally, a good personal essay aspires for permanence, whereas a good social media post aspires for ephemerality, right? They need to be disposable. They need to tell us who we are using this genre at this point in time. But a personal essay should aspire for permanence. Okay, so now I want to transition a little bit from talking about essays we've read to talking about essays that your students write. So you all know, as I mentioned earlier, that high school writing is often about getting students to make arguments based on evidence, right? That's one of the key things that we're trying to do, especially in high school, teaching students to move towards making arguments based on evidence. But it can also be based on what composition theorists call expressivism, which is the approach, the idea that people can best be encouraged to explore the power of language by writing about themselves and about their feelings. So we're trying to do two different things. We're trying to teach students structure, argument, use of evidence. We're also trying to trigger students to be able to write, to be able to express themselves, to be able to talk about themselves. But of course, students learn in argumentative essays, and I still hear this from my students, that you're not allowed to use the I. You're not allowed to use the first person. You're not allowed to use I. So we end up with this kind of bifurcation. There's the writing that's about me, and then there's the writing that makes arguments with evidence. So the personal essay is the kind of place where we can help them think about breaking down that simplistic and incorrect distinction. And it's also a place where we can help them think that personal writing isn't just expressivist. It's not just a place to as creative writing teachers say, vomit all over the page as the creative writing, and produce a kind of solipsistic writing that's just about me. What we want to do in high school and in college is to help them learn to produce writing about themselves that is also of interest to others and that communicates something to others beyond this is who I am. So what I do in this is I use what I call the X and Y formula for explaining to students how to write about themselves in a way that is interesting to others. And I stumbled across a couple of years ago when I was preparing for this workshop the first time I did it, a great graphic, not even a graphic novel, but a sort of like comic book about people who do these kind of stories for a living, especially on the radio. So I'm going to turn my presentation over to the illustrator, Jessica Abel, for just a second here. And so these are her pages where she's interviewing the radio storyteller, Alex Bloomberg. So he talks about, I've developed a mathematical test to tell whether you're on the right track. Topic is X, whether it's interesting is Y. If you've got X and you've got Y, you've got a story. What we need to do in helping students learn to write is have them do this test, have them work through that equation. You simply tell someone about the story you're doing and say, I'm doing a story about X, and what's interesting is Y. And you tell somebody that. So here's an example. If you end up with something like, I'm doing a story about people who come back injured from Iraq, and if you can't put the second half together, you're heading into uncertain waters. For example, I'm doing a story about a homeless guy who lived on the street for 10 years. And what's interesting is that he didn't get off the streets until he got into a treatment program. Well, this wasn't as interesting to people. This might be what happened, but it's not interesting enough to tell a story about. So it ended up being, I'm doing a story about a homeless guy who lived on the streets for an Iraq veteran who lived on the streets for 10 years. And what's interesting is that there's a small part of him that misses being homeless. Or what's interesting is that he fell in love while homeless and is still haunted by that love. Or what's interesting is he learned valuable and surprising life lessons while homeless, lessons that he applies regularly in his current job as an account manager for Oppenheimer Mutual Funds. So this is how I try to teach students about taking a personal experience and make it interesting to other people. And you always have to run it by someone else. And I'm going to just tell you a brief personal story here. So I've just completed a book, and it's a biography of someone that no one has ever heard of. And I found this person enormously interesting. And so I was trying to get a publisher to publish this book. And so I would approach publishers and I could talk about this person at length and with his life and why it was fascinating to me and all these amazing things that he did. And everybody's response was, so what? Why is this interesting to anyone except you? And so I had to come up, as did Alex Bloomberg here in this one slide, I had to come up with about 7 different whys for my X. None of them worked eventually. I mean, eventually I came up on one, but I failed so many times. This person had this really interesting life. He did all these things, and he's interesting to you because this. And the editors would say, no, that's not interesting to me, and it's certainly not going to be interesting to readers. So I had to try over and over again. And like we're telling our students that you need to bounce it off someone else, I had to bounce it off a bunch of editors who said, this isn't interesting to me. And finally, someone said, well, what about this? Well, is this the thing? And that's how I finally stumbled upon the way that allowed me to write the book. So it's not just with our students, it's with ourselves. Okay, so X and Y. So let's see how this formula applies to the things that we've just been looking at. So like with Baldwin, the X, my experience with the rage that comes from being subjected to racism taught me that one cannot, like my father did, live in rage. One must accept and understand things as they are, without the blindness of rage, without being complacent, in order to create change. X and Y. Didion, like so many others, as a young woman, I came from the provinces to the great metropolis, and it was magical. But the magic ends as I became an adult and I had to live in an adult world. What's the why? One can live too long in a magic world, and when you do, it curdles. So when using this for student writing, and this is what we'll be doing in the second half of this program, is we simply start with X and Y. What's your X? What do you want to talk about? And what's your Y? Why is it interesting? Students and us want to just say X. This happened to me. This was the best summer ever. This is what happened when my grandma died. And they think that it's sufficient. Teachers and readers' job is to help students go from inside their own heads to then communicating with an audience. How can I help you make X interesting to others? How can I help you figure out what your why is? The best summer I ever had is X. Here is how the best summer I ever had taught me that work can actually be a fun thing. That's a why. So as we were talking about, doing this in groups or with a partner is absolutely crucial. Somebody has to be able to speak back and say, like, is my why actually interesting to you? Can you tell me why this is interesting, or more usefully, why this isn't interesting? And maybe, what do you find interesting about this thing that happened to me? What questions would you have for me? The partners, and this is what we'll be doing in the second half, need to say, well, your why doesn't work. This isn't interesting, but here is what it might be, what one might find interesting. So we can use this exercise to help students connect their own lives, not just to the larger world, but to other people's experiences. Okay, so the focus sentence. Once you have your X and Y topic, why topic and why is interesting, then we would then in a class exercise, and this is what we'll do, move on to the focus sentence as a way to further plan the essay. And a focus sentence is this: I did A because B, but C. Where A is the action, B is the character, and C are the complications or the conflicts or the obstacles that give that action meaning and arc. So finally, and I'm just going to go back. Yeah. Finally, I'll just, before we break up into our groups, I have posted a number of different personal essays that you can use in your classes. They're all very anodyne. They're all, and I noticed that a lot of you, as you were posting in the chat and posting in the challenges, you were using quite challenging essays by people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and things like that. All the ones that I have here are very mild, largely apolitical. But you may want to use them simply as a way to talk about craft. So one of them, and some of you may have read this in the past, is the classic personal essay, which is, here is my experience and here's how I changed because of it. And the example that I have is E.B. White's, he's the author of Charlotte's Web, you may know his name from that, Once More to the Lake. Wonderful, beautifully written essay, well worth reading. It's also really short. I talked earlier about Megan Dom's Music Is My Bag, which is another really popular kind of personal essay for younger people to write, in that I am a part of a group with its own practices and assumptions and language, and I am going to explain them to you. Younger people like to talk about how their subculture or how their clique or how their group does things differently and how they develop their identity from that. And Dom's essay is a really interesting example of that and can be a nice jumping off place for students to develop their own similar kinds of essays. There's another type of essay called thick description, where the author is simply trying to use language to provide the readers with as vivid of a sensory experience as possible. Like, I had this sensory experience and it's so hard to convey it through language, but I'm going to try. And what I've included here is a very short piece by Larry Wood called Ode to an Orange, which is about a guy who was, lived most of his life in North Dakota and what it felt like to get fresh oranges in the middle of the winter. I will use words to capture sensory experience in a way that will allow you to have that experience in the way that I did. We've talked about this one as well, Gloria Anzaldua's How to Tame a Wild Tongue, which is about one's personal relationship with language. And this is especially about being bilingual and code switching. Anzaldua is and many of you know her, she's a Texan writer, South Texas writer, and she would sort of code switch back and forth between English and Spanish. I use language in ways that are unique and at times opposed to standard English. I would imagine that for many, many of you, this is a topic that is of great interest and relevance to your students. And then finally, and Sherman Alexie is I don't know if you're going to want to use him, he's a sort of controversial person because he had some sexual harassment in his past. But his essay, Superman and Me, is a wonderful example of what's called the literacy narrative. And the literacy narrative is a type of essay that is especially popular these days in college writing teaching that basically boils down to, here is how I learned to read, and here is what reading meant to me and helped shape me as a person. This can also be a very good one for teaching high school students. Okay, before we break into breakout groups to conduct our little activity, which will also be my suggested activity that you use with your students. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone have any questions? Anything? I can't see if anyone has hands up, so you can shout them out. Laura, do you see if anyone has hands up?
None so far, but
Okay. All right.
I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
Can you go back to are you going to give us the prompt again with the formula that A is action, B, but C? Are you going to tell us what that formula is for that starter sentence again?
Yeah, and in fact, we're going to be doing that.
Okay.
In fact, right now we're going to be doing that. And maybe Elizabeth, that's a good segue. So yes. So what I want to do now, is Laura's going to break you all up into groups, and I want to take about maybe 15 to 20 minutes to do this. So this is what I want to do for the first part of it. Everybody, and I have this slide up so everyone can see it. So in your groups, each person should come up with an idea for a personal essay in the X and Y format, something from your own life. I want to write about X that happened to me or X that I've been thinking about. And it's interesting to other people because why? Just write down that sentence. Write it down for yourself. And then when everybody's had a chance to write one of these down, each person then will read theirs to the group. And for each person, other group members, I want you to say, what might make it more interesting or relevant to others? What might make it more interesting or relevant to you? So somebody might say, I want to write about I just got back from a trip to Ireland with students, as I had mentioned. I want to write about my trip to Ireland that I've been thinking about. And it is interesting to others because I saw the change in Ireland since Brexit happened. So others might say, well, it's interesting, but what I'd really be interested in is what is it like to take a group of college students through a place where the drinking age is 18, not 21. So I would like everybody to write down your own sentence, take 2 or 3 minutes to do it, don't overthink it, but then go around, and I'll be popping in and out of these groups, read your sentence out, and then other people formulate a response with like, that's interesting, what I really might want to hear about, what would really make this interesting would be X. And again, what we're simply trying to do is model what you're doing with your students, because I think this is a really valuable exercise for students. So then after you've had a chance to hear everybody's feedback on yours, then revise your X and Y sentence accordingly. You don't have to do what everybody says. You might still say, like, I think this is interesting, but given that feedback, how might you then revise this?
First,
So
the first two things I thought were, first of all, just establishing that sense of like trust with each other, so we're all good to go. I like to do this circle thing where we have to remember everyone's name. Everybody makes mistakes. And then also maybe doing like a 5-minute rewrite before we get to the right thing so they can kind of like get it all out there and then take a longer thing and make it shorter.
great. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Paula, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I would suggest doing it with them. For me, when students see you struggle, you know, because I mean, we all have issues with writing about ourselves. And I think if, you know, you start this struggling with them and then seeing what we all come up with, I think another way, and what I'm thinking, I teach dual credit English and I teach Comp 1 and Comp 2 in one semester. And so I'm very limited with time. And so I think for me, I teach 3 different things. And so I think it could be a great activity for each different type of essay that I teach, because I teach a visual analysis, an argumentative, and a rhetorical analysis essay. And I think I could pull like 3 different personal essays and it would segue into that. That would be my suggestion for what I would want to do.
All right. Junior Rodriguez.
Yeah, so I agree with writing with them, just for them to see our mistakes, but I also would include the idea of that we can have a idea that just doesn't work. And so it's not just, oh, this is not the way I want to say it and just go with context of writing, but more specifically, this idea won't work. I know that sometimes we want to shield ourselves as teachers because we're obviously brilliant and perfect, but at the same time, some of these ideas won't work and they won't, maybe it's a little too personal. And I know it's hard for us to do that in front of our kids, but maybe we can be strategic about that one, the throwaway idea, quote unquote, and then show them why it was a throwaway idea. You know, this is too sensitive, this won't work. I don't want to go there with my students, or I don't want to go there with my peers, and then talk about that, saying, hey, it's okay to have personal experiences that are sheltered and private, but we can also shift into a different way and then show them how we, you know, how you would do that. And I just feel like it is personal, it is sensitive, and it's hard with teens. And I don't have a teenager of my own to know that, but I do work with teenagers. And I feel like that idea of I need to be perfect and I don't want my peers to know that I have these life experiences and I don't want to write it down, and then maybe show them how that would look like on paper or type it out and be like, okay, that doesn't work. And be okay with that idea of not all your life has to be shared right in the school environment or in the learning environment, but other experiences can be validated.
Thank you. Any other sort of responses or practical?
I do one of the first essays I teach AP juniors. One of the first essays that we write is based on a photograph. And so I do I show a photograph of myself and I read the essay that I've written, which after being in my group, I think I'll modify it, make it a little bit different this year. But mine's about having breast cancer. And I think that when I share that with my students, they see that I've been very thoughtful about it, that I'm sharing something very personal and it's not just kind of a throwaway, you know, idea that I'm giving them. And they in turn become very thoughtful and kind of introspective in the topics and the images that they choose. And not all of them are trauma dumping. A lot of it is, you know, they're a group of friends or, you know, the relationship they have with a parent or the loss of someone. And they're always just very beautiful and well done essays. But I think giving them this part of it would help to kind of understand their goal more of why am I sharing this? Why is this experience that I have important? Because I think for so many of them, they don't think that experience that they have is relevant to anybody else other than themselves. You know, they're teenagers, so everything's all about themselves. And of course, no one cares about that experience. So I think this would be a good way to have them in conversation, still starting it the same way, but making it a little bit more focused with, okay, so you have a goal, like here, think of an image in your head, think of a real picture, scroll through your phone, find something that's meaningful to you. And that's a good jumping off point. Maybe they don't finish with that, but that's a good way to start to try to get them to hone in whatever their ideas might be.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. Anyone else?
I think,
Oh,
sorry, I think Janie had a good idea. I don't know if she wants to speak to it, about writing a writing journal. What were you saying, Janie? She was from my group.
oh yes, about using journals and writing in order to like help navigate either, you know, what thoughts they might have or the person might be having. So maybe I was thinking about the idea of journaling and maybe making it more of a routine in the classroom. And of course, I was discovering that for my own self and how I've used it as I was growing my identity as a mom. But maybe just getting the students to focus on some focus for the week, maybe theme or idea using the X and Y idea, and then journaling about it and showing them how the journaling every day about whatever that focus was changes and helps them either in a cathartic way or maybe in a more focused way, maybe in a productive way. And other topics aren't going to be fruition, right? So as you get them to change the XY and then here they are journaling, they might reach a point where this is not interesting to me anymore. And then having that conversation with them would probably be even more helpful, right? Because all our ideas aren't always brilliant. So.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, and I actually think that your last point, and I'm sure you all know this as teachers, but your last point is really important because sometimes in the process of coming up with an idea and working it through a rather formalized process, which is what I have here, and then on the other side of it, you will realize this doesn't even work, you know, and it's not a failure on your part. It's when that happens, and I think that's just speaking here as a writing teacher. That's a success in itself when you have come up with an idea and tried it out and bounced it off people, and then at the end you realize this doesn't work. And I'll just share another story. I had, again, because I've been immersed in this man's story for 10 years, that I had this little snippet from his life that I was convinced was of great interest. And I wrote it up as an essay and I sent it out to a couple magazines, and I was like, you can't go wrong with this. It's got like action and spies and Hitler and everything, and definitely someone's going to want to be interested in this. And I just kept getting this response of like, this is a bunch of pieces that don't cohere in the end. You know, you've got a bunch of interesting parts and you think that they work together, but you're not seeing that they don't go anywhere. You have a bunch of interesting parts and that's it. And I did at the end have to, after working on this and writing 3 or 4 different versions of it, kind of say like, yes, I now realize that this is not worth, it's interesting pieces that don't come together as a story. And so they need to be used somewhere else. They don't work as is. And so as writers and as writing teachers, it's really valuable for us to know when to cut bait and when to suggest to students that they cut bait, and that that's not a failure, and that that is part of the writing process, and that's part of the thinking process. Thank you. What I was thinking of doing, and I think that we're now already at 10:35, and so I'm not sure that we'll, because I was thinking of doing another breakout and doing the focus sentence, the A, B, and C sentence, and I don't think, unless people really want to do that, I don't think that we need to do that. Because I think you've sort of gotten the sense here of taking your revised X and Y, I want to write about this, and here's why it's interesting to me. And then moving from that sort of basic structure of topic, why it's interesting, to then what we call the focus sentence, which is like, I did or I experienced A because of this thing about my character and my personality, but C would be the conflicts and the obstacles and whatever that happened to it. I'm not sure that we need to do that, especially because now that we're so late in the hour, and then to run into feedback about that. So maybe maybe we'll just sort of pull back now and talk. Does anyone have any, not just about this small group activity that we've just done, but in general, reflections about or new or further thoughts that you've had about teaching nonfiction and teaching personal essays, now that we're wrapping this session up? What other ideas have come to you? What other practical strategies? I know that we always want these workshops to provide people with practical tools and strategies that they can actually use in the classroom. What are some of the ideas or potential strategies or brainstorms that anyone's had based on the last hour and a half we spent together? Anyone wants to?
This is Jana. I have my students, I've taught resource for the past few years, resource English to ninth graders. And
I'm sorry, Jana, what is, I don't know, what does resource English mean?
it's special education, like a pull
Okay.
out. The model essays are amazing and I love them, but they're adults, years separated from the events that they're telling.
Mm-hmm.
And my students are ninth graders with special needs. So they have not had the chance to reflect back, or they have not had the life experience to see the change that has made, or that a certain event has made on them. So they have real trouble thinking about how that event affected them.
Yeah.
So if you have any advice about getting our kids to be reflective on small things that happened to them that are important and how they are important. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Well, one of the tried and true examples of that and you're so right that a ninth grader simply doesn't have the duration of life to have perspective on that. But one of the tried and true strategies for that is a literacy narrative. So think about like, what's your first experience with reading? What's the first memory you have of being read to? What's the first memory you have of reading? What did it mean to you? What was your relationship with it? That's usually far enough back that students can reflect on that a little bit. Or you might also ask them, what's your first memory? What's the first memory that you have in your life, and what has it meant to you? And most of them should be able to remember something from the time they were 3 or 4 years old, and it could just be a flash or an image or something. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it is. These are essays written by adult professional writers who have had time to reflect on these experiences, and that's not something that ninth graders have. I don't know if anyone else has any ideas to help Jana, and I'm sure many of you also are teaching or in a similar situation.
Hey there. I was thinking about maybe just taking a general theme from the story and ask them like a really simple question about, how do you feel about loss? How do you feel about, trust and, deceit? Have you ever felt this or that way before? And then have them write about that and make it a bell ringer, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it takes. It doesn't have to be a bunch, but you give them the spark and then maybe get them into a small group and then have them share with a shoulder partner and say, let's take 2 minutes. Partner A is going to share their idea from the bell ringer. Partner B will share theirs and do the same thing that we did in our small group. I mean, ours is a little bit extensive and we're professional, so we already know how to steer the conversation, but make it a point to like have a slide presentation for every time that you want them to do writing. And I teach ninth grade. I've taught all levels from like 6 to 12. So I find that most kids just have a hard time honing in on the idea. And somebody did talk about that, like just, reining it in, like you can have these really great conversations, but at the end of the day, what are you going to focus on and why? And that the idea of the XY is wonderful. I really think that it's something they can gravitate toward, something that they also see a lot in academia where they use XY in algebra and there's XY like in science, and just trying to make cross-cultural cross-curricular connections that really just kind of helps overall with kids just being comfortable with writing and just the process of being in school. I think just school in general is really intimidating and they have a hard time with standardized testing, and they don't want to have to be forced to think about stuff they don't like. But at the same time, it's like, a lot of us are forced to teach things that we'll, never use again or that we don't even like. So, I don't know, it's crazy. Like I could go on and on, but just to kind of bring it back in, I think just breaking it down for them, giving them a slide and showing them this is what you're supposed to do, giving them an example, and then maybe popping in just how, we were all kind of like checked in on, like, hey, how are you doing? And let me share what I think. And, just really guiding it for them, just really being very specific about what you want, giving them a checklist, giving them a T-chart so that way they can put ideas in. So like the T-chart can have anything like, who are your characters and where's your setting? What are the first two big ideas that you want to present to your readers? What is the overall goal that you want them to get out of it? And have them do simple sentences. Like, I said, it doesn't have to be huge, but getting them to spark the idea first, small sentences. And then you can always integrate grammar and revise editing, stuff like that.
Well, and your idea of starting with, let's say you read Baldwin, and what's the time, the prompt to be something like, what's the time when you have felt rage at a power that seemed greater than you?
Mm-hmm.
And start with that, and then move to, well, what's your X? What was this? What was this thing that happened to you? And then maybe this becomes the seed for an essay. That's a wonderful idea for kind of starting, rather than just like think of something that happened to you, but a prompt that comes out of an essay that you've had the students read. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you guys very much.
Anyone else?
I put some ideas in the chat. I don't know if you read those. I didn't want to interfere with anyone speaking.
I'm not. I can't see the chat because I have my screen sharing on. But I think that Laura, I think, right, you're going to make the chat transcript available, right?
Yes, the chat transcript and the slides will be on Google Classroom afterwards. If y'all want to kind of continue the conversation and all such things.
So main emphasis was, and I'm just giving more ideas because I want to try this for myself this year, is the idea of journaling being not just a put down task. So we're going to circle back. It's a whole week. You're focused on what you said, X, Y. So going back to your kids, it's like validating even their smallest thought and then expanding more. So then your next question will be for the day, instead of just saying, okay, add more details. No, like actually have that focus attention. So, well, what was that moment like? Let's talk about the setting more. Let's talk about the context more. Let's talk about today. Let's talk about, okay, if you could bring in another person who wasn't there at that party or at that moment, who would you bring in? An uncle and aunt? Let's make up a character. Let's make that character fictional. What would that character bring to the party or to the event? So kind of helping them value what they already started, I think is the best thing for students who struggle with writing, instead of just being a one-time task. Okay, you turn it in, you're done, let's move on kind of tasks. Kind of validating it and adding more is what I want to try this year.
I think too, I mean, really taking this process slow in the beginning, starting with just X. Like, let's spend a day on X where we're reading, we're reading one of these things and kind of modeling, and then going to that Y, because then we can, throw up the equation in, I don't know, December for their final for the semester and say, okay, now you're going to write an essay using our equation, go. then they have their confidence really built up with this other stuff and they know how to do it. That's the part I think where our students get stuck, is they know the what. This is what I'm supposed to do, and this is why it's important, but I don't know how. So, you know, with that, just taking it slow, modeling with them. A couple of people have said it, like, we should always be writing with our students. There is zero reason why our writing should not be up in our room. I have a spot on one of my boards in my classroom where it's like things that I've written, where the kids can walk up and they can read a poem that I wrote. They can read an essay that I wrote, because this is valuable to me, but they're not going to believe that it's valuable if they don't see me doing it. So I would say I can't remember who it was that was saying that they're concerned about their kids, their special ed students with this. Start really, really slow. Don't try to do this in a 2-hour span or an hour span like we just did. Spend an entire week on this process to build that up for those kids.
Thanks, Meredith. Well, anyone have any final thoughts or comments?
Okay, I have to chime in finally.
Oh, please, please.
I, just like so many of you guys, believe in the frequency and the number of things that we can give them to see what, you know, will help them in terms of pre-writing. I did this thing where, so I teach dual credit juniors. Mine are, you know, motivated in all the wonderful ways. But I gave them the memoir essay in January, just because of the flow of things and how our semester had started. It hadn't happened until January. It was a game changer. Anyway, I was, you know, changing things up and making things a little bit different. I assigned them, and I have a flex seating classroom, so they're already in little groups, you know, self-selected groups. I don't give seating charts. Anyway, I gave them a note card, and I had them do we'd already read some and analyzed some memoir essays and stuff like that. And I gave them a note card, and I had them write a 6-word memoir, a list of all their 6-word memoirs. And so they played with the word choices, and they played with punctuation, and they had the inherent tension that I wanted to see built into those 6 words. And so then we talked about how they might go forward with the essay, and this would be a seed and all of that. And so they were so cute. They came up to me after, you know, while they were producing, and I of course did mine on the board. And, you know, mine were telling, you know, like I went there with them, and the 6, you know, words too. And so they had the range of experiences with mine on the board. But theirs were very telling, and I could tell kind of where they were going or where they wanted to go based on the words they chose. And they were so willing and wanting to share with me, and it was so sweet. They were the same with their partners. But what happened as a wonderful side effect to all of this was that eventually, when they wrote their essay, this was something that they built on, you know, the memoir essay. Eventually, when they wrote their essay, they had something to work with in terms of a title. And that was a really cool side effect, because I guess I hadn't anticipated that. I mean, it makes sense, but titles are so difficult for them anyway to come up with. And as we know, they sort of just tack something on at the end to call it a title.
Titles are difficult for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. So it worked out really well. And the size of the note card, you know, it wasn't intimidating. They spent the whole hour doing it. We didn't rush any of those, you know, all of those things. And I would say all of those things together impacted the quality of their writing. The timing, you know, later, you know, halfway through the year versus, you know, in August when we didn't know each other as well. The note card, the grouping, the title, I mean, just all of it together.
Thanks. Those are really good suggestions. Well, I think that we'll wrap things up. I want to thank you all for participating in this. It's a real pleasure for me to do these workshops and to learn about the challenges that you all face as secondary teachers. Many of my students are training to be secondary teachers. We have a big ed school here at Duquesne University, and they're training to be teachers in the state of Pennsylvania. And so it's really, really valuable for me to learn about the kind of the practical challenges and the strictures that you all face in the secondary classroom that are so different than one faces as a college teacher. And I hope that you found this useful. And as Laura said, this PowerPoint deck will be available on the Google Classroom. Also, I have posted some sample essay prompts that you can use, both sort of general for having students write analyses of personal essays, but also to write their own personal essays. And then sample prompts about the essays that I posted, like the E.B. White essay and the Ansel Dua essay and things like that. So I hope you find those resources to be valuable. And again, I appreciate your time and attention. I hope this was useful. And I just want to thank Humanities Texas for setting this up. And yeah, and good luck as you all prepare for next year.